The crystal glass felt cold and heavy in my hand, a stark contrast to the fire blazing in my chest. From the shadows of the landing, I watched them. My own daughter, Caroline, and her husband, Richard. They were holding court in my home, a home that once echoed with the thoughtful discourse of world leaders, now filled with the braying laughter of social climbers. They thought I was upstairs, tucked away, a relic in my own museum. They were about to learn that relics, when disturbed, can have a surprisingly sharp edge. The party was an ambush, though I hadn't seen it at first. Caroline had called it a small get-together. A few friends, she'd said, a chance to liven up the old house. I should have known better. The steady stream of sleek black cars, the clatter of catering staff in my kitchen, and the booming voice of some B-list congressman from the foyer told a different story. This wasn't a get-together. It was a full-blown political fundraiser, a brazen colonization of my life's work, my sanctuary. I had retreated upstairs, the noise, a physical assault. Genevieve would have never stood for this. Her presence, a ghost of grace and steel, was a constant ache in my heart. She knew how to manage these crowds, how to separate the wheat from the chaff with a single, disarming smile. I, on the other hand, had grown weary of the performance. I was halfway to my study when I heard my name, carried on a wave of sycophantic laughter from the bottom of the grand staircase. I paused, one hand on the cool oak of the banister. It was Richard's voice, slick with expensive scotch and self-satisfaction. He was talking to a developer whose face I recognized from the society pages. "Don't mind him," Richard was saying, a dismissive flick of his wrist. "Marcus is from another era. Since a quiet word in the right ear is still how things get done. He doesn't understand the new DC. It's all about volume now." The developer chuckled, a low, greasy sound that made my skin crawl. He had no idea what volume my quiet words could achieve. Then my Caroline, my little girl. Her voice, once the sweetest sound, now dripped with a carefully cultivated condescension. "Daddy is a darling, of course, but this house is wasted on him. It's a stage, and he's forgotten how to perform. He just potters about, lost in his memories. We're trying to gently persuade him it's all too much. For his own good, you understand." The lie was so smooth, so practiced. It was a dagger wrapped in silk, and she plunged it right into my back, without a tremor in her voice. The words struck me, not with the heat of anger, but with the cold, clear shock of a winter morning. They saw me as an obstacle, a doddering old fool standing between them and this house, the ultimate symbol of the status they so desperately craved. They weren't just disrespecting my home, they were erasing my entire life, my legacy, Genevieve's legacy, reducing it all to a backdrop for their pathetic social climbing. In that moment, something within me shifted. The grief I held for my wife hardened into a diamond point of resolve. I did not storm down the stairs. I did not raise my voice. The diplomat in me, the man who had navigated tense negotiations in far-flung capitals, took control. An outburst would be a performance on their stage, to their rules. It would only confirm their narrative of me as a senile old man. So I turned. I did not make a sound. I retreated into the quiet of my study, the heavy door closing with a soft, definitive click, shutting out their noise and sealing their fate. Inside, surrounded by books and maps and the ghosts of past triumphs, I sat in Genevieve's favorite wingback chair. I didn't tremble with rage. Instead, a profound, icy calm settled over me. They wanted a show. They wanted to understand power in the new DC. I would give them a masterclass. I would teach them that the loudest person in the room is often the weakest, and that true influence, the kind that lasts, is built not on noise, but on the unshakable foundation of respect, a respect they had just forfeited. My mind, which they thought was lost in memories, began to work with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. It was like dusting off a complex piece of machinery. I saw the network of my life, the threads of obligation, friendship, and loyalty I had spun over 50 years of service. They saw a tangled mess of the past. I saw a web, perfectly preserved, waiting for a spider to pluck a single strand. The plan began to form, not as a raging fire, but as a meticulously constructed blueprint. It would not be a frontal assault. That was their crude method. Mine would be a campaign of whispers, of strategically placed truths. It would be elegant, precise, and devastating. And it would all begin with a single, quiet phone call. I reached for the antique rotary phone on my desk, its weight familiar and comforting in my hand. I didn't need a smartphone to find the number I needed. It was etched in my memory, a relic from an era when a man's word was his bond. I dialed the private number of Senator James Albright, a man I had mentored decades ago, a young, idealistic aide who had been like a son to me. I had seen the spark in him, the core of integrity that was so rare in this town. Now he was one of the most respected and genuinely powerful men on the Hill. He owed me nothing, but I knew he would take my call. Our relationship was built on the old ways, on mutual respect, a currency Caroline and Richard would never understand. He answered on the second ring, his voice tired but warm. "Marcus, is everything all right?" He knew I never called this late, or this number, without good reason. "James," I said, my own voice steady and calm. "I find myself in need of a bit of advice, and perhaps a favor." I didn't plead or complain. I simply laid out the situation, not with the emotion of a wounded father, but with the dispassionate precision of a diplomat outlining an international incident. I painted a picture of ambition, disrespect, and profound betrayal. It was a long silence on the other end of the line. When James finally spoke, the warmth was gone, replaced by a cold fury that I knew well. "They did what? In Genevieve's house?" He revered my late wife. She had hosted his first fundraiser, a small, elegant affair in this very living room, when he was a nobody with big ideas. The insult was not just to me. It was to her memory. "What do you need, Marcus?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Anything." I told him my plan. It was simple, really. It wasn't about destroying them financially, at least not directly. It was about turning their greatest asset, their desperate craving for social validation, into their ultimate weapon of self-destruction. I wanted to hold up a mirror to them, a mirror so large and so public that the entire city would see them for what they were, shallow, grasping, and utterly classless. I needed a specific kind of mirror, one that only a man like James could provide. The next few days were a quiet agony of waiting. The party debris was cleared, but a greasy film of their presence remained. Caroline and Richard were insufferably smug. They called me daily, their voices syrupy with false concern. "We're just worried about you, Daddy," Caroline would coo. "This big old house is such a burden. We found a lovely little condo community for you in Potomac. So secure, you wouldn't have to worry about a thing." Each word was a little shove towards the exit of my own life. Richard was more direct. He'd come over with brochures and financial statements, spreading them on my mahogany dining table, like a conquering general laying out maps. "Marcus, let's be practical," he'd say, pointing at figures. "The upkeep, the taxes, it's a drain. Signing it over to us now makes perfect financial sense. It's the smart play." He spoke of my home as if it were a stock portfolio to be liquidated, not the vessel of my entire adult life, the place where I had loved a woman and raised a child. I played my part beautifully. I was the doddering old man they believed me to be. I would feign confusion, misplace my glasses, and ask them to repeat their points. I let them think they were winning, that their gentle persuasion was working on my feeble mind. Every time they left, patting each other on the back for a job well done, I would stand at the window and watch their car pull away, my calm resolve hardening into something akin to granite. Their condescension was the fuel for my quiet engine of revenge. I used the time to prepare. I went through old photo albums, not for sentiment, but for evidence. Pictures of Genevieve with first ladies, me with presidents and prime ministers, a young James Albright, all earnest ambition, standing beside me in the rose garden. I gathered letters, notes, and journals. I wasn't just defending a house. I was curating the story of a life they had tried to declare over. I was preparing my testimony for a court they didn't even know was in session. Then, one morning, the call came. It was from a woman named Sarah Jenkins at the Washington Post. Her voice was bright, professional, and full of energy. "Mr. Thorne, Senator Albright suggested I reach out to you. He mentioned you might have a story to tell. We're doing a feature for the style section on classic Washington homes, the ones that hold real history. He said yours was the finest example." The first strand of the web had been plucked. The vibrations were beginning to travel. I feigned surprise. "Of course." "Oh my, I don't know. It's just an old house." Sarah was gently persistent. "The senator spoke so highly of you and your late wife, of the salons you used to host. He said it was a kind of integrity Washington is in danger of losing. He thinks your story is important." She used the magic word, integrity, the very quality my daughter and her husband sought to purchase with their loud parties and borrowed money. They would soon learn it could not be bought. I agreed, with a display of humble reluctance. We set a date for the interview and photo shoot for the following week. I didn't tell Caroline or Richard. Why would I? In their minds, I was probably busy looking at brochures for condo communities. The silence was a crucial part of the strategy. Surprise is a powerful diplomatic tool, and in his personal war, it would be my atomic bomb. I let them continue their campaign, blissfully unaware that their own battlefield was about to be reshaped entirely. The day before the Post interview, Caroline and Richard ambushed me again. They arrived unannounced, armed with paperwork and a notary. Their smiles were stretched tight across their faces, a grotesque parody of familial concern. "We've done it, Daddy," Caroline announced, waving a sheaf of legal documents. "We've made an offer on the condo. We just need your signature on these transfer documents to finalize things. It's for the best." The final push. They smelled victory. I looked at the documents, at the clinical language that would sever my connection to this house. "It seems a bit rushed," I murmured, peering over my reading glasses. Richard stepped forward, his patience wearing thin. "Marcus, we've been over this. It's a formality. We're taking the burden off your shoulders. Think of it as our gift to you." A gift. The audacity of it was almost breathtaking. They were trying to steal my home and call it an act of charity. I held the pen in my hand, feeling its plastic lightness. I looked from my daughter's eager face to my son-in-law's greedy eyes. They were practically vibrating with anticipation. They thought this was the end of the story. The doddering old man finally gives in. I let the silence hang in the air, a thick, heavy blanket of their own making. Then I placed the pen deliberately down on the table, next to the unsigned papers. "I think I'll sleep on it," I said softly. "One final night." Their faces fell in perfect, comical unison. The frustration was a flash flood they barely contained. "Daddy, don't be difficult," Caroline started, her voice losing its sugary coating. Richard cut her off with a sharp look. "Of course, Marcus, take your time," he said, the words tasting like acid in his mouth. They collected their useless papers and left, the front door closing with a sharp crack that echoed their fury. They didn't know it, but they had just lost everything. The next morning, the house was transformed, not by caterers, but by a quiet, professional team. A photographer, his assistant, and the reporter, Sarah Jenkins. They moved with a hushed reverence, their eyes wide with appreciation for the history that soaped the very walls. "This place is incredible," Sarah whispered, looking at a photo of Genevieve laughing with a young Queen Elizabeth. "It feels real." I simply smiled. It was a real life, I replied, a life of service. I led them through the rooms, not as a tour guide, but as a storyteller. Each piece of furniture, each painting, each worn spot on the Persian rug held a memory, a piece of the larger narrative. I spoke of diplomatic breakthroughs hammered out over coffee in the study. I talked about Genevieve's legendary ability to seat sworn enemies next to each other at dinner, and have them leave as, if not friends, then at least respectful colleagues. I was painting a picture of a different Washington. Sarah's pen flew across her notepad. The photographer captured the light streaming through the old, wavy glass of the windows, the dignified patina of age on the silver, the quiet power of the room. He took my portrait, not in a stiff pose, but sitting in my armchair, a book in my lap, the ghost of a smile on my face. It was the picture of a man at peace in his kingdom, a patriarch, not a prisoner, a pillar of an era they were so desperate to emulate, but could never understand. As the interview wound down, Sarah asked the inevitable question, her tone gentle. "It must be a lot to keep up with. A house like this. Do you ever think of downsizing?" The bait was laid. I looked her in the eye, my expression one of weary sincerity. "It's funny you should ask," I began, my voice soft with manufactured vulnerability. "My children are very concerned about that. They feel this house, my history, is a burden I should be relieved of." I let that sentence hang in the air. Sarah's eyes sharpened with journalistic instinct. She sensed there was more to the story. "They're encouraging you to sell?" she prompted. "Oh, more than that," I said with a sad little chuckle. "They believe so strongly it's for my own good that they've taken to hosting events here themselves to show me how the house should be used. Fundraisers, parties. They want to bring a new energy to the place." I was feeding her the narrative, piece by damning piece, all under the guise of a proud, if slightly confused, father. I made sure to mention the name of the congressman whose booming voice had echoed from my foyer. I mentioned the developer Richard was schmoozing. I gave her just enough detail. "They have such drive, such ambition," I concluded, my voice a perfect blend of paternal pride and subtle concern. "They truly believe they are the future of this city, and this house is the perfect stage for them." Sarah just nodded, her expression unreadable, but I knew. The hook was set deep. After they left, a profound quiet settled over the house. It felt cleansed, as if the professional respect of the post team had washed away the greasy residue of my daughter's ambition. I walked into the dining room and looked at the empty, gleaming mahogany table. This was the calm before the storm. The story would run in the Sunday edition. In 3 days, the mirror I had so carefully arranged would be revealed, and Caroline and Richard would be forced to look at their true reflection. I spent the next 2 days in peaceful solitude. I tended to Genevieve's roses in the walled garden. I read Thucydides. I did not answer the increasingly frantic calls from Caroline. They must have sensed a shift in the wind, a change in my demeanor. My quiet refusal to sign their papers had unnerved them. Their pressure had failed, and they didn't have a backup plan. They were tacticians, not strategists. They could only see the immediate prize, not the long game. On Sunday morning, I did not have to go out to get the paper. A special courier, arranged by James, delivered a thick, crisp copy of the Washington Post to my door. I didn't open it right away. I made my coffee, a slow, methodical ritual. I toasted a piece of bread and buttered it precisely to the edges. I sat in the breakfast nook, the sun warming my face, and prepared myself. This wasn't just revenge. It was a course correction, a painful but necessary lesson in honor. Finally, I opened the style section. And there it was. The headline was larger than I had anticipated. It read, "The Statesman's Sanctuary, Inside the Timeless World of Marcus Thorne, a Pillar of Old Washington." The main photo was the one of me in the armchair, looking serene and in command. But it was the subheadline that was the true masterpiece of political journalism, the stiletto in the ribs. As a new generation scrambles for influence, one Georgetown townhouse stands as a monument to earned respect. The article was a masterpiece of implication. It never explicitly criticized Caroline or Richard. It didn't have to. It simply held my life up as a standard of quiet dignity and let the reader draw their own conclusions about their loud, frantic striving. It praised Genevieve's legendary hospitality, framing it as an exercise in intellectual and political substance, a stark contrast to a mere party. Sarah Jenkins had woven my quiet words into a tapestry of damning praise. My phone began to ring. Not Caroline. It was old friends, colleagues I hadn't heard from in years. "Marcus, what a wonderful piece. A much-needed reminder of what this city should be about." Genevieve would have been so proud. Each call was a small affirmation, a brick being laid back into the foundation of my life. They weren't just reading about my house. They were reading about our shared values, values they also felt were under siege. I can only imagine the scene at their sprawling, mortgaged McMansion in the clean. I picture them seeing the headline, perhaps with a flash of narcissistic excitement. "Look, darling, we're in the Post." Then the slow, sickening crawl of comprehension as they read the text. The coded language, the subtle juxtapositions, the realization that they were not the heroes of this story. They were the punchline, the unnamed new generation scrambling for influence. Their arrival was not long in coming. I heard their car squeal to a halt outside. No careful parking this time. The doorbell chimed a frantic, angry peal. I took a slow sip of my coffee before rising to meet them. I opened the door to find them standing on my porch, their faces a mask of fury. Caroline held a crumpled copy of the style section in her hand, as if it were a weapon. "What have you done?" she hissed, her voice trembling. Richard pushed past her. "Done? He's humiliated us. This is a public execution. Every call we've gotten this morning has been awkward. People are laughing at us, Marcus." His face was pale, his usual flick confidence completely gone, replaced by the raw panic of a man watching his future burn to the ground. He was right, of course. Washington doesn't forgive being made to look foolish. It is the city's cardinal sin. I stepped back and gestured them into the foyer, the very spot where they had mocked me. I remained calm, my demeanor that of a patient teacher dealing with unruly students. I did nothing but tell a reporter the truth about my life, about your mother's life. Is it the truth that you find so humiliating? My quiet question seemed to enrage them further. They were used to shouting matches, not the cold steel of logic. "You twisted everything," Caroline cried, tears of rage, not sorrow, streaming down her face. "You made us sound like grasping, shallow opportunists." "Did I?" I asked, my voice still even. "Or did I simply describe your actions and allow people to form their own opinions? You threw a fundraiser in my home without my permission. You spoke of me as if I were already a ghost. These are facts. They are not my invention." That was when I revealed the key piece of information, the one they were completely unaware of. "You're mistaken about one thing," I said, looking directly at Richard. "I didn't call the Washington Post. I wouldn't even know how. No, the person who arranged the interview was Senator Albright." The color drained from Richard's face. Caroline stopped crying, her mouth hanging slightly open. The name landed in the room with the force of a physical blow. I let the silence stretch, savoring their shock. "James was very disappointed when he heard about your party," I continued softly. "He has fond memories of this house, of Genevieve. He felt your event was a desecration of that memory. He believes, as do I, that true influence is built on respect. The article, he felt, was a necessary way to remind certain people of that fact." I saw the final gear click into place in their minds. This wasn't just their doddering father. This was a U.S. senator. Their entire scheme had been predicated on the idea that I was powerless and disconnected. They had tried to leverage my legacy while simultaneously believing it was defunct. The revelation that my oldest and most powerful connections were not only intact, but actively defending me, shattered their worldview. They had not just been disrespectful to me. They had offended one of the very men whose favor they were so desperate to curry. It was a strategic blunder of catastrophic proportions. They left without another word. There was nothing left to say. Their anger had been extinguished by pure terror. They stumbled out of my house, the house they had tried to steal, not as conquerors, but as what they truly were, children who had been caught playing with matches and had burned down their own playhouse. I closed the door, the solid click echoing in the suddenly peaceful hall. The final phase of my plan was complete. The consequences were now in their own hands. The fallout was swift and brutal, a perfect case study in Washington physics. The Post article became the talk of the town. People didn't speak of it as an attack, but as a poignant commentary. The developer Richard had been courting suddenly found his permits tied up in a new layer of bureaucratic review. The B-list congressman publicly praised me for my long years of service. carefully distancing himself from my ambitious daughter and her husband. Invitations to the galas and fundraisers they lived for simply stopped arriving. Calls went unreturned. Caroline was quietly asked to step down from 2 prominent charity boards, citing a need for new leadership. Richard's consulting business, built entirely on the perception of access, withered and died within a month. No one wanted to be associated with people who had so publicly and foolishly alienated a man like Senator Albright and a pillar like me. They were socially blacklisted. In the ecosystem of Washington, D.C., this was a fate worse than financial ruin, though that soon followed. They had built their entire identity on being seen, on being included. Now, they were ghosts. The very fate they had tried to assign to me had become their own. They were the ones lost in a city that no longer saw them. Their political ambitions not just ruined, but reduced to a cautionary tale told over cocktails in Georgetown. As for me, my life was quietly reborn. The article had reminded the city that I was still here. Old friends, real friends, began to drift back into my orbit. We didn't have fundraisers. We had dinners. We didn't shout over loud music. We talked. We debated. We remembered. The house once more echoed with a thoughtful discourse I had missed so dearly. It became a salon again, a quiet harbor of integrity in a noisy sea of ambition. One afternoon, a small tentative note appeared in my mailbox. It was not from Caroline or Richard. It was from their son, my grandson, a college student I rarely saw. "Grandpa," it read. I read the article. "I'd like to hear more about Grandma, and about your life, if that's okay." It was a small seed of hope, a sign that perhaps not all was lost. That one branch of the family tree might still grow towards the light. I wrote back immediately. I'd like that very much. He began visiting on Saturdays. We would sit in the study, and I would tell him stories. Not to brag, but to teach. I told him about Genevieve's courage, about the quiet sacrifices of a life in public service. He listened with an attentiveness his parents had never possessed. He saw the house not as a stage or an asset, but as I did, a living repository of history, of a life built on principles. He was mending a relationship, but entirely on my terms. I never heard from Caroline or Richard again. I learned through my grandson that they had to sell their house in McLean and move to a smaller place in a town far from the Beltway, a place where their names meant nothing. Their exile was complete. There was no joy in this knowledge for me, only a profound and weary sadness for the daughter I had lost, not to death, but to a hunger for a world that was never real. My victory was not in their ruin, but in my own reclamation. I had reclaimed my home, my legacy, and my peace. I had reminded my small corner of the world that character is not for sale, and respect is not a commodity to be traded. It is earned, slowly and quietly, over a lifetime of keeping your word and honoring your commitments. A lesson my daughter had tragically failed to learn. Tonight, the house is quiet. The scent of Genevieve's roses drifts in from the garden. Senator Albright and a few old friends are coming for dinner. We will drink good wine, eat simple food, and talk about the state of the world. There won't be no cameras, no reporters, no braying laughter, just the gentle clinking of glasses and the murmur of conversation, the soundtrack of a life well lived. They thought I was a relic from a bygone era. Perhaps I am, but they forgot that some eras produce things of lasting quality, things like honor, loyalty, and integrity. They mistook my silence for weakness, and my age for irrelevance, a fatal error in a city built on the ghosts of powerful men and the memories they leave behind. My revenge was not a fiery explosion, but the quiet closing of a door. I did not destroy them. I simply held up a mirror and allowed their own ambition and disrespect to do the work. They were not defeated by an old man. They were defeated by their own character or lack thereof. It was a lesson in the truest and most ancient form of justice. I look at a photograph on the mantelpiece. Genevieve and I at an embassy dinner years ago. She was smiling, her eyes full of the wit and intelligence that captivated world leaders and charmed sworn enemies. "Well, my love," I whispered to the quiet room, "I believe I've aired out the house. It's ours again." And in the peaceful silence that answers, I feel a sense of profound and final vindication. Family is a complex tapestry, woven with threads of love and obligation, memory and resentment. Sometimes a thread must be cut to save the whole cloth. My actions were not born of hate, but of a desperate need to protect the fabric of the life Genevieve and I had woven together. It was a painful, necessary act of preservation. The new Washington may be about volume, as Richard so foolishly said, but volume fades. Noise dies down. What remains is the foundation, the quiet, unshakable bedrock of a life built on something real. My grandson sees it now. He is learning the difference between the echo and the voice. In him, the legacy continues. The lesson was simple, yet they could never grasp it. This house, my life, was never about power in the way they understood it. It was about influence. The power they sought was a hammer, loud and crude, meant to smash down doors. The influence I wielded was a key designed to quietly unlock them. They never bothered to learn the difference. Their desperate need for social status was a bottomless pit. No matter how many parties they threw, no matter how many important hands they shook, they would always be empty. They were chasing a reflection in a window, never realizing that the real substance was inside the house they were trying to claim but could never truly possess. My moral compass has always been Genevieve. In every moment of this ordeal, I asked myself what she would have done. She would not have tolerated the disrespect, but she would have acted with grace and precision. I hope I have honored her memory, not just by protecting our home, but by doing so with a diplomat's quiet touch, rather than a fool's angry roar. The sun sets over Georgetown, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The lights of the city begin to twinkle, a constellation of ambition and power. From my window, I watch it all, no longer a part of its frantic dance, but a quiet observer, a gatekeeper of a history they tried to erase. A pillar, as the paper said, and a pillar's job is to stand firm. My grandson asks me if I am lonely. I tell him no. This house is not empty. It is filled with a lifetime of memories, with the echoes of laughter and serious debate, with the unshakable presence of the woman I loved. I am not a relic in a museum. I am a curator of a life that mattered, and now I have a new student to teach. Justice, I've learned, is not always about punishment. Sometimes it is simply about balance. It is about restoring a natural order that has been disrupted. Caroline and Richard were a loud, discordant note. The article, the senator, my quiet plan, it was all just a way of gently, but firmly, restoring the harmony of my world. They saw me as a doddering old man who had lost his influence. What they failed to understand is that influence, true influence, is not something you lose, like a set of car keys. It is something you are. It is the sum of your life's choices, your integrity, your reputation. It is a quiet authority that needs no volume to be heard. The greatest tragedy is that they could have had it all, not the house, but the legacy. It was theirs for the taking, had they only shown a shred of respect, of love. But they were so blinded by the sparkle of the frame that they never bothered to look at the portrait within. They wanted the symbol, that they despised the substance. Now a new, simpler life begins. A life of quiet conversations, of mentorship, of tending to roses and memories. My Georgetown townhouse is a salon once more. A place where integrity is the price of admission. It is a smaller world than the one I once inhabited, but it is a truer one. And in the end, that is all that matters. The crystal glass feels cool at my hand. From the top of the staircase, I look down into the quiet, lamplit foyer. It is empty now, save for the ghosts of a better time. They thought my world was ending, that I was a chapter closing. They were wrong. It was not an ending. It was a turning of the page.